Like many of you, I always thought of quantum dots as this amazing ingredient that was made for the display industry, that its main purpose was to make us all successful and rich. And then a few months ago, I met someone who you'll be hearing from soon, Olga Alexopoulou. And it just blew my mind what she was doing, the things that she was doing, this idea of using quantum dots across this range of applications through pigments was just jaw-dropping. So I thought this would be a truly amazing addition to this week when we've been celebrating so many aspects of quantum dots. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce her. I'll just go through her bio very briefly. We'll have the talk and then we'll do some Q&A. There's enough time. There's some Q&A. There's a mic there, so you'll be able to come up and ask your questions. So Olga is a painter, and her work has been exhibited in galleries and museums from Tokyo to New York. She was born in Athens and studied at the Ruskin School of Art at Oxford University. In 2018, she created a new pigment called Quantum Blue with a small team of scientists at Berkeley Lab in California. Now she's head of color and co-founder at Quantum Light, the only company in the world that specializes in quantum pigments. Please join me in welcoming Olga.
If I were to ask you, which are the most important powders in your life, what would you say? Some of you, especially after a delicious lunch, would probably think of coffee. Some of you of sugar. Others would think of life-sustaining powders called medicine. However, there is one category of powders that is intrinsic to the human experience that people completely take for granted. These powders were invented before humans could even grasp the concept of how to build a roof above their heads or how agriculture works. But we know that humans have been passionate about creating these powders for at least 64,000 years. What are they? If we could change the slide. Pigments. These powders have helped humans leave a trace of their existence to survive for eternity, knowing that they themselves wouldn't. They have helped people express their dreams, their desires, their fears, and create whole universes from their imagination. Maybe if I could get a little beepy thing, or change the slide otherwise. Great. Our cave-dwelling ancestors found rocks lying around nearby, ground them up, and probably using pulverized amber as a binder, they created a pigment they could spray and leave their handprints as a mark for posterity. Next slide. Over the thousands of years of human history, people have gone to extremes to create pigments, like making pigments from dead people. Introducing caput mortuum, a pigment made from flesh of mummified bodies that was popular all the way until the mid-20th century. Here we see a painting by one of the most prominent Victorian painters, Sir Lawrence Alma-Tadema, who used this brown pigment excessively for its warm and translucent qualities. The pigment, also known as mummy brown, was made by ground-up mummies from Egypt, and apparently it didn't matter whether the bodies came from men, women, or children. As the trade took off all over Europe, dealers of the prized brown started using freshly executed prisoners whose bodies would be treated with bitumen and then exposed to the sun before being ground up to create the pigment. Horror and beauty cohabit in this work of art. Some years ago, I had a solo show at the Heraklidon Museum in Athens, Greece, and the museum designed some workshops for children to complement my exhibition. The workshops were meant to give kids an idea of how paint works. So they started the workshop, led by University of West Attica lecturer Maria Hatzidakis, by showing a photo of this bug to the kids and asking them, would you eat this? Of course, all the kids said no. And then the workshop teacher asked, have you ever had a red lollipop? To which the answer was, of course, yes. Well, I have news for you. The cochineal bug is a current global staple of the food industry when it comes to making products look red. So the truth is that most of us have been consuming it for years. It is added in juices, yogurts, ice creams, candy, soft drinks by some of the most recognizable drinks of today. It is also the go-to red for the world of cosmetics for lipsticks. So the lips of the girl with the pearl earring were also painted with cochineal red. How did the bugs end up on Vermeer's most recognizable portrait? The female cochineal insect that you see in the photo were first used as early as 700 BC by South American civilizations for their stable red. The immobile insect is brushed off the cacti it lives on, then boiled, left in the sun, and processed until the red powder is extracted. The Aztecs used it extensively, and after the Spanish conquest, its trade became intertwined with slavery as it was imported to Europe. Today, you can find it very often by looking at the word carmine or natural red number 4 on everyday products on the labels in supermarkets. Luckily, the history of pigments has not always been this harrowing. The Renaissance owes its brilliance to a pigment called ultramarine blue. The name comes from Latin, meaning beyond the seas, ultra and mare, as it was mined in the ancient quarries of Saresang in Afghanistan. The mining of lapis lazuli, which is a stone that ultramarine comes from, begins as early as the 7th millennium BC, which is contemporary to the first cave painting I showed you. The stone is used in antiquity as a pigment, but reaches its height during the Renaissance. It's not easy to convey just how important ultramarine has been for the history of art, or just how precious it was, as it was even as expensive as gold. Ultramarine blue was so highly prized, and its production took so long, as it had to be carefully ground up and purified, that it was reserved only for the most important parts of a painting. Often, artists kept the minuscule amounts that their patrons had procured for them hidden away, and only at the final stage of the painting would they use it for the prestigious parts, like the Virgin Mary's robes, and even then, only for the final top layer of the blue. As a painter, I have spent years studying the color blue from antiquity to today, often traveling around the world to explore rare blue pigments, from rural China and the capital of porcelain in Jingdezhen to top research institutions in the US. There was one blue that intrigued me, that of the blue hour. It took an army of 19th and 20th century scientists to explain the eerie and almost fluorescent blue color the sky takes on during the blue hour, which is the brief twilight after sunset and just before sunrise. As the sun slips below the horizon, the sky lights up an intense blue for about 30 minutes before fading out as night falls. The British Lord Rayleigh proved that the scattering of light generally makes the sky blue, but more specifically, the physicist Edward Orson Halbert was the first to understand that specifically during the blue hour, the blue is more intense thanks to a phenomenon recorded by the Frenchman James Chapois while studying the angle from which the remaining rays of the sun strike the ozone layer, the Chapois effect. And finally, our own eyes, as they make the transition of how we see night, myopic vision before night vision, registering the blue as brighter, the Purkinje effect. But how could one distill this particular and very intense blue of the blue hour into a bottle to use as a pigment on a painter's palette? In August 2018, I landed in California to see if my theory that the blue hour could be turned to a pigment with the help of nanotechnology could become a reality. I remember that summer morning as I stopped at the foot of Berkeley Hills and looked up at the top, which was shrouded in a thick mist. Behind the haze loomed the famous Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, where some of the world's most important scientific discoveries had been made. The whole project has started a year and a half earlier under the auspices of Professor Paul Alivizatos, one of the most internationally recognized nanotechnology scientists. What was my idea? That I could harness the incredible optical properties of the particles called quantum dots to create a new type of pigment. Quantum dots, which most of you know from the display industry, are small particles of crystalline semiconductors and constitute a new class of materials. They are very pure in color, and despite their amazing optical properties, they had never been used to form an artist pigment. Quantum dots, due to their size, lie between classical physics and quantum mechanics, and thus exhibit the phenomenon of quantum confinement. Due to the pressure of this phenomenon, the light, and consequently the color they emit, is more intense than conventional pigments. Inside the the underground laboratory, deep beneath the Earth's surface, at the end of our trials, I remember picking up a small vial and looking into it. The blue hour had been distilled into a small bottle, and quantum blue was now a reality. Fast forward a few years, and we are now an Oxford University-affiliated startup called Quantum Light, which is dedicated to bringing Nobel Prize award technology to the world of colors, pigments, and dyes. Today, at Quantum Light, we are harnessing the extraordinary power of quantum confinement to create the pigments of the future, quantum pigments. Along with Jason Hartlove, who most of you know as the co-founder of Quantum Light, and also former CEO of Nanosys, and current Vice President of Display and Optics at Meta, we have created a small team of some of the most brilliant minds in the field of quantum dots and pigments. This past October, the extraordinary scientists Alex Akimov, Louis Bruce, and Moungi Bawendi were awarded the Nobel Prize for inventing and developing quantum dots. For me, one of the most fascinating moments from their journey was about 4 decades ago when Louis Bruce noticed that the sample he had left on a lab bench was changing color in a strange way, which made him think that he was witnessing quantum physics at play. In the middle, we see a photo of an original sample from Alexei Akimov's experiments of quantum dots in a glass matrix, because he started his journey by trying to understand the color in the art of stained glass windows. This eventually led to the invention of quantum dots, and in turn, on your right, a photo of quantum red, one of our first quantum pigments. Because of all this, quantum pigments will have phenomenal optical qualities. Firstly, for the first time, we are manipulating light to create pigments never seen before. To quote my co-founder, Jason Hartlove, we will be painting with light. With conventional pigments, if you mix red and green, you get brown. With quantum pigments, because they follow the way light is mixed, which is additive, when you mix red and green, you get yellow. Even this small fact is revolutionary for an artist's palette. Secondly, being able to emit light at any specific wavelength in the visible spectrum. The size of the quantum dots determines its wavelength, and thus color output. The smaller the dot, the more intense, and hence the blue light is emitted. The bigger the dot, the redder the light is emitted. Quantum dots can be engineered to emit at any chosen nanometer on the spectrum of light. This goes for the visible but also invisible part of the spectrum. Thirdly, being significantly brighter than conventional pigments. And fourthly, being illuminant independent, as I will explain in the next slide, is because of quantum confinement. This very simple diagram is actually the most important one in my presentation, because it actually explains what happens when we utilize quantum confinement in pigments. Conventional red pigments absorb light and reflect only the red part of the spectrum. Quantum pigments absorb and then emit the whole spectrum, but convert it into a specific chosen red color, down to the nanometer. This makes them not only significantly brighter, but also it means that the color does not change depending on the environment's illuminant. What does that mean in practice? Imagine that you have a car painted with blue conventional pigments, and you park it at night in an underground parking lot. Usually, the parking lots have orange lights, which means that when you will be looking for your blue car, it will appear green. Whereas if it was painted with quantum blue, it would always appear blue, because it would always be emitting at the chosen wavelength, and you wouldn't lose your car. All these unique optical qualities make quantum pigments the next chapter in the history of pigments. So this brings us to the question, where can quantum pigments be used? And the answer is pretty much everywhere. Art, architecture, plastics, apparel, automotive. One of our scientists said, if we ever created hair dye with quantum pigments, it would look like CGI characters walking around the streets. What about the environmental facts? The production of an average kilo of conventional pigment produces approximately 10 kilos of waste, which is mostly discarded in countries like India and China. And if we think about the textile industry, well, it uses 1.3 trillion gallons of water to dye garments, enough to fill 2 million Olympic-sized swimming pools. Most of this water, loaded with harmful chemicals and dyes, flows untreated into rivers and streams, whereas our quantum dots are produced in a net zero factory, where the little water that is used is continuously recycled on the premises. When we think of quantum pigments, we think of the colors we already know, but brighter and consistent. However, there is more. For example, our team is developing quantum black, a super black with a red glow. This new super black is achieved by especially formulated quantum dots that take light and emit it back in the non-visible part of the spectrum, and only leave a tail of emission in the red. This creates a very intense black with a mysterious red glow, as you can see on the sample on your right. There are loads of pigments like that are waiting to be discovered. To quote the Nobel Committee, quantum dots open up a third dimension in the periodic table. Pigments that create a play between the visible, the invisible, and with tail ends in all sorts of colors. And we're only just beginning. Thank you very much.